Some people move through life carrying tension everywhere they go. One careless comment changes their mood. One moment of disrespect stays in their mind for days. They replay conversations in silence, argue with people who are no longer in the room, and slowly lose their peace trying to control a world that was never fully under their control to begin with. But there is another way to live, a quieter way, a way where criticism no longer owns your mind, where rejection no longer defines your worth, and where your calm becomes so steady that chaos around you stops feeling personal. The Stoics understood something most people never truly learn. The moment another person controls your emotions, they control your inner world. And most people surrender that control without even noticing. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Once that truth settles deeply inside you, something begins changing. You stop reacting to every opinion. Stop chasing validation from people who cannot even validate themselves. And strangely enough, the calmer you become, the stronger you feel. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because your mind no longer collapses every time life becomes difficult. Most people spend years fighting the world without realizing the real battle was always internal. The need to prove yourself, the need to be understood by everyone, the need to defend your identity every time someone challenges it. But peace begins the moment awareness becomes stronger than reaction. And once that happens, you stop giving your energy to every disturbance around you. You begin moving through life differently, quieter, clearer, more grounded within yourself. Most people think anger begins in the moment. They think it was created by the disrespect, the criticism, the cold tone, or the careless words thrown across a conversation. But anger is rarely born that quickly. In most cases, it has been waiting beneath the surface for years. The moment itself is only the spark. The real fire was already there, hidden beneath old fears, unresolved pain, and beliefs that were never fully questioned. That is why one person can walk away from an insult unaffected, while another carries the same moment for days, replaying it endlessly in their mind. The difference is not the situation itself. The difference is what the situation touched internally. Most people never stop long enough to examine this honestly. They stay focused on the outside world because blaming someone else feels easier than confronting what already exists within them. Someone raised their voice. Someone interrupted them. Someone failed to show respect. The mind immediately points outward and says, "That is why I feel this way." But Stoicism teaches something far less comfortable and far more liberating at the same time. Events themselves are neutral until the mind assigns meaning to them. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply when he wrote that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not caused by the thing itself, but by your judgment of it. Most people hear words like that and move on quickly. Very few actually sit with the weight of what it means. If emotional pain is shaped by interpretation, then anger is not simply happening to you. It is being filtered through memory, expectation, identity, and old emotional conditioning. A careless comment can awaken years of insecurity. A moment of rejection can reopen the fear of being unimportant. A disagreement can feel unbearable because somewhere deep inside being wrong became connected to shame instead of growth. On the surface, it looks like a simple argument. Underneath it, an entire emotional history is being activated without awareness. This is why reactive people often feel exhausted without fully understanding why they are not only reacting to the present. One criticism connects itself to years of earlier criticism. One disappointment awakens every disappointment that came before it. The nervous system reacts before awareness has time to intervene. And once emotion takes control, clarity disappears quickly. People say things they do not mean. They defend themselves against threats that were never truly there. Then they spend hours trying to protect an identity that should never have depended on the moment to begin with. The Stoics believed freedom begins with observation. Before you can change a reaction, you must first notice it clearly. You notice how quickly the ego wants to defend itself. You notice the tension rising in the body before words are even spoken. You notice the mind building arguments before the other person has finished speaking. That awareness creates distance between you and the emotion. Without awareness, anger feels automatic. With awareness, it becomes something you can observe instead of obey. And that distinction changes everything, because emotions lose much of their power once they are seen clearly. There is also something humbling about realizing that not every emotional reaction is truthful. Intensity does not automatically equal wisdom. Strong emotions can still come from insecurity, fear, pride, or unresolved pain. Many people assume that because they feel deeply offended, they must also be morally correct. But feelings are not always accurate reflections of reality. Sometimes they are reflections of wounds that were never healed properly. The Stoics understood this well. They trained themselves to pause before reacting because they knew the first emotional impulse is often the least reliable guide. Calm observation reveals far more than immediate reaction ever will. Over time, this awareness changes the way you move through conflict. You stop treating every disagreement like a threat to your identity. You stop seeing every criticism as an attack on your worth. And slowly the world becomes less emotionally exhausting because your peace is no longer entirely dependent on other people behaving perfectly around you. You begin realizing that anger often says more about attachment than strength. The more attached you become to respect, admiration, and validation, the easier it becomes for the world to disturb your peace. That does not mean becoming passive or accepting mistreatment without boundaries. It means understanding that inner stability cannot survive if it depends completely on external behavior remaining favorable at all times. People will misunderstand you sometimes. They will project their frustration onto you. They will speak carelessly. None of that disappears from life completely. But suffering increases the moment you expect the world to constantly protect your emotions for you. That is why Stoic discipline feels so powerful when practiced consistently. It slowly shifts attention away from controlling other people and back toward understanding yourself. You become less interested in winning emotional battles and more interested in protecting clarity. You stop asking why someone acted poorly and start asking why the situation disturbed you so deeply. That small shift changes the entire direction of growth. Instead of spending your life fighting every external trigger, you begin healing the internal patterns that gave those triggers power over you in the first place. And in that quiet awareness, anger slowly loses its authority, because understanding yourself becomes more important than defeating anyone else. The mind has a habit of turning small moments into personal verdicts. A delayed reply becomes rejection. A distracted tone becomes disrespect. Someone disagreeing with you suddenly feels like proof that you are unimportant or misunderstood. The interpretation happens so quickly it feels inseparable from reality itself. But the mind is always creating stories, and those stories are often shaped more by conditioning than truth. That is why a simple interaction can change someone's emotional state for an entire day. The event itself may have lasted only seconds, yet the internal reaction continues long after the moment has passed. Many people unknowingly build their identity around external validation. They feel stable when they are praised, understood, included, or admired. But the moment that approval disappears, their emotional state begins collapsing with it. A stranger's opinion suddenly carries enormous weight. A careless comment stays in the mind for hours. Someone failing to acknowledge their effort feels deeply painful because their sense of worth has quietly become attached to external recognition. Once validation becomes emotional oxygen, every interaction starts feeling psychologically important. This is why reactive people often live in constant tension without realizing it. They are not simply experiencing life. They are monitoring how they are being perceived at all times. They analyze facial expressions, pauses in conversation, tones of voice, and changes in behavior, searching for signs of acceptance or rejection. The nervous system becomes hypervigilant because identity feels dependent on social confirmation. Something as simple as being interrupted can suddenly feel deeply threatening because internally it is interpreted as disrespect or dismissal. The Stoics understood how dangerous this attachment could become. A person whose peace depends entirely on external behavior will never truly feel steady. People are unpredictable. Opinions shift constantly. Approval comes and goes. Building emotional stability on something so unstable guarantees suffering eventually. Epictetus warned against placing happiness in things outside your control, because the moment those things change, your peace disappears with them. Most people understand those words intellectually, but living them is far more difficult because the need for validation runs deep. Human beings naturally want to feel seen and valued. The problem begins when that desire transforms into emotional dependence. Dependence changes the way you move through life. You begin adjusting yourself constantly just to avoid criticism. You over-explain because misunderstanding feels unbearable. Even silence from others starts feeling loaded with meaning. The mind fills empty spaces with assumptions, and most of those assumptions lean toward insecurity rather than clarity. That is why so many people suffer inside imagined conversations that never actually happened. They are reacting not to reality itself, but to interpretations shaped by fear and emotional attachment. But something changes once awareness deepens. You begin noticing how often your mood rises and falls according to the reactions of other people. You notice how quickly praise lifts you and criticism weakens you. And once you see the pattern clearly, you stop obeying it automatically. Someone criticizes your choices, and instead of immediately defending yourself, you pause long enough to ask whether the criticism actually defines you. Someone ignores your message, and instead of spiraling into insecurity, you recognize the mind trying to create unnecessary conclusions. That pause matters more than most people realize. It interrupts the emotional chain reaction before it fully takes over. Many people are consumed by their own insecurities, frustrations, and internal struggles. Once you stop assuming every uncomfortable interaction is a judgment of your worth, life becomes psychologically lighter. You stop chasing reassurance in every conversation. You stop needing every disagreement to end with validation. And slowly your emotional world becomes less fragile, because your identity is no longer entirely placed in the hands of strangers, moods, or temporary opinions. That is where real stability begins. Not when the world suddenly becomes kinder, but when your inner state stops rising and falling with every shift in external behavior. You still value respect, you still appreciate connection, but your peace no longer depends on receiving those things at every moment. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer fighting endlessly for confirmation, and strangely enough, the less desperate you become for approval, the more grounded your presence naturally feels. And if these ideas are helping you see yourself more clearly, consider subscribing to this space, not for noise or distraction, but as a reminder that self-mastery is possible, even in a world constantly pulling the mind away from itself. Part of the reason this happens is because many people unknowingly build their identity around how they are received by others. They feel stable when they are praised, included, understood, or admired, but the moment that approval disappears, their emotional state begins collapsing with it. A stranger's opinion suddenly carries enormous weight. A careless comment lingers in the mind for hours. Someone failing to acknowledge their effort feels deeply painful, not because the moment itself is unbearable, but because their sense of worth has become tied to external recognition. Once validation becomes emotional oxygen, every interaction starts feeling psychologically important. This is why emotionally reactive people often feel trapped inside constant tension. They are not simply responding to life as it happens. They are constantly monitoring how they are being perceived. They analyze facial expressions, tones of voice, pauses in conversation and changes in behavior, searching for signs of acceptance or rejection. The mind becomes hypervigilant because identity feels dependent on social confirmation, and when the nervous system believes belonging equals safety, even small moments begin triggering disproportionate emotional responses. Something as simple as being interrupted can suddenly feel deeply threatening because internally it is interpreted as disrespect, dismissal, or loss of value. The Stoics understood how dangerous this attachment could become. They knew that a person whose peace depends entirely on external behavior will never truly feel steady. People are unpredictable. Opinions shift constantly. Respect is inconsistent. Approval comes and goes. Building emotional stability on something so unstable guarantees suffering eventually. Most people understand those words intellectually, but living them is far more difficult because the desire for validation runs deep. Human beings naturally want to feel seen and valued. The problem begins when that desire quietly transforms into dependence. Dependence changes the way you move through life. You start adjusting your behavior just to avoid criticism. You over-explain yourself because misunderstanding feels unbearable. You become emotionally exhausted trying to manage everyone's perception of you. Even silence from others starts feeling loaded with meaning. The mind fills empty spaces with assumptions, and most of those assumptions lean toward insecurity rather than clarity. That is why so many people suffer inside imagined conversations that never actually happened. They are not responding to reality anymore. They are reacting to interpretations created by fear, pride, and emotional attachment. There is a certain freedom that appears the moment you stop needing constant agreement from the world around you. Not because you become cold or detached, but because your identity no longer collapses every time someone sees you differently than you see yourself. This shift does not happen overnight. It begins slowly through observation. You start noticing how often your mood changes based on other people's reactions. You notice how quickly praise lifts you and criticism weakens you. At first, this realization feels uncomfortable because it reveals how much control outside opinions have held over your inner state for years. But awareness changes the relationship entirely. Once you see the pattern clearly, you stop automatically obeying it. Someone criticizes your choices, and instead of immediately defending yourself, you pause long enough to ask whether the criticism actually defines you. Someone ignores your message, and instead of spiraling into insecurity, you recognize the mind trying to create unnecessary conclusions. That pause matters more than most people realize. It interrupts the emotional chain reaction before it fully takes over, and inside that interruption, something steadier begins forming. That perspective softens emotional personalization because it shifts attention away from the ego. Not everything people do is about you. Many people are distracted by their own struggles, consumed by their own insecurities, or reacting from wounds they do not fully understand themselves. Once you stop assuming every uncomfortable interaction is a judgment of your worth, life becomes psychologically lighter. You stop chasing reassurance in every conversation. You stop needing every disagreement to end with validation. And gradually your emotional world becomes less fragile, because your identity is no longer entirely placed in the hands of strangers' moods or temporary opinions. The need for constant approval loses some of its grip. In its place comes a quieter form of confidence, one rooted less in being admired and more in understanding yourself clearly enough that outside reactions no longer decide your value. That is where real stability begins, not when the world suddenly becomes kinder, but when your inner state stops rising and falling with every shift in external behavior. You still appreciate respect, you still value connection, but your peace no longer depends on receiving them at every moment. The mind becomes calmer because it is no longer fighting endlessly for confirmation. You begin moving through conversations with less fear, less defensiveness, and far less emotional urgency. And strangely enough, the less desperate you become for approval, the more naturally grounded your presence feels. People sense it without you needing to announce it, because calm confidence always speaks more quietly than insecurity does. One of the hardest truths to accept is that other people will eventually disappoint you. No amount of kindness guarantees kindness in return. No amount of honesty protects you from deception. No amount of patience prevents someone from misunderstanding your intentions. This is where many people begin losing themselves emotionally, because they move through life believing they can control how others behave if they just say the right thing, explain themselves clearly enough, or treat everyone well enough. But human beings are complicated. People act from fear, insecurity, jealousy, pride, confusion, and emotional wounds. They may not even fully understand themselves. The Stoics recognized this long ago, which is why they placed so much attention on inner discipline rather than external control. At first, that idea sounds simple. Focus on your response instead of trying to control the world around you. Most people agree with it immediately in theory, but theory disappears the moment life becomes personal. It disappears when someone spreads lies about you. It disappears when your loyalty is ignored. It disappears when your calmness is mistaken for weakness, and your silence is treated like permission to disrespect you. Those are the moments where philosophy stops being intellectual and becomes practical. Because anyone can appear emotionally balanced when everything is comfortable, real self-control only becomes visible when your emotions are demanding immediate reaction. That is why difficult people often become unexpected teachers, not because their behavior is admirable, but because they expose the exact places where emotional discipline is still fragile inside you. Someone insults you, and suddenly pride wants revenge. Someone questions your worth, and the ego immediately wants to defend itself. Someone behaves unfairly, and anger starts building before conscious thought even has time to intervene. The reaction feels automatic, because most people have spent their entire lives practicing reaction rather than awareness. They believe emotional impulses should always be trusted simply because they feel strong. But intensity is not wisdom. Immediate emotional certainty is often the very thing that destroys clarity. The Stoics trained themselves to understand this distinction deeply. They knew that the first emotional impulse is rarely the highest form of intelligence. It is usually survival instinct mixed with ego and conditioning. That is why they practiced pause, not suppression, not denial. Pause, a space between feeling and action. In that space, something important becomes possible. Instead of becoming consumed by emotion, you begin observing it. You notice the urge to interrupt, to defend, to attack, to prove. And the moment you notice the impulse clearly, you are no longer completely controlled by it. Most people never realize how much power exists inside restraint. Modern culture often celebrates immediate reaction. Speaking without thinking is mistaken for authenticity. Emotional outbursts are framed as honesty. Quick retaliation is confused with strength. But there is nothing powerful about losing control of yourself every time life becomes uncomfortable. Real power is quieter than that. It appears in the ability to remain steady when your emotions are trying to pull you into chaos. It appears in the decision not to say something destructive simply because anger temporarily made it feel justified. Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself constantly because he understood how easy it is to lose awareness during emotional moments. He reminded himself that people act according to what they believe is right, even when they are mistaken. That perspective softens emotional reaction because it shifts the focus away from personal offense. Most people are not waking up each morning planning how to ruin your peace. They are reacting from their own fears, frustrations and limitations. Understanding that does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes the way you carry it internally. Instead of absorbing every interaction like a personal attack, you begin seeing people more clearly as human beings struggling with themselves. This awareness changes conflict completely. You stop viewing every disagreement as a battle for identity. You stop feeling the need to dominate conversations simply to protect your pride, and slowly silence stops feeling like weakness. Many people speak impulsively because silence makes them uncomfortable. They feel that if they do not immediately defend themselves, they lose. But often the strongest response is the calmest one, not because you are passive, but because you are no longer desperate to prove your value through reaction. A person fully controlled by emotion is predictable. A person capable of restraint becomes difficult to manipulate. That restraint also protects your peace in ways most people never experience. Emotional reactions do not disappear once the conversation ends. They linger. They replay inside the mind for hours. Anger continues burning long after the moment itself has passed. One impulsive argument can steal an entire evening of peace because the nervous system remains trapped inside emotional activation. This is why emotionally reactive people often feel mentally exhausted. Their mind never fully rests because it is constantly carrying unresolved tension from one interaction to the next. But when you begin practicing conscious response instead of automatic reaction, life starts feeling different internally. Someone criticizes you, and instead of immediately collapsing into defensiveness, you breathe long enough to separate your identity from the comment itself. Someone behaves disrespectfully, and instead of mirroring their behavior, you remain aware of the fact that another person's lack of discipline does not require you to abandon your own. That awareness creates emotional stability slowly, one moment at a time. The Stoics understood that peace is not built during easy seasons of life. It is built in moments where reaction feels justified, but self-control is chosen anyway. That is the real test of inner strength. Not whether you can remain calm when nothing is wrong, but whether you can remain grounded when the ego feels wounded and emotion is demanding immediate release. Because in those moments, your response shapes more than the situation itself. It shapes the kind of person you are becoming internally. Most arguments begin long before words are spoken out loud. They begin internally, in the silent space where pride feels threatened and the ego starts preparing for battle. By the time people are raising their voices, interrupting each other, or trying to dominate the conversation, the actual exchange of ideas has usually disappeared completely. What remains is emotional defense. Two people struggling to protect their identity at the same time. That is why so many conversations leave both sides feeling misunderstood, even after hundreds of words have been exchanged. Nobody was truly listening. They were only waiting for their turn to respond. This becomes obvious once you begin observing people carefully during conflict. Notice how quickly someone stops listening. The moment they feel criticized, their body changes, their tone shifts. The mind immediately starts building counter-arguments instead of understanding what is being said. Most people enter disagreements with the hidden goal of self-protection rather than truth. They want to preserve their image, defend their position, and avoid feeling emotionally exposed. That is why even small conversations can suddenly become emotionally intense. The argument is rarely just about the surface topic itself. Underneath it, something more personal is being defended. A person who feels secure internally does not need every disagreement to become a battle. They can listen without collapsing emotionally. They can hear criticism without immediately viewing it as an attack on their worth. But insecurity changes everything. The ego becomes hyper-reactive because disagreement starts feeling dangerous. A different opinion feels like rejection. A challenge feels like disrespect. And once the nervous system enters that defensive state, clarity disappears quickly. People begin speaking from emotion rather than understanding. They interrupt because they are afraid of losing control of the conversation. They raise their voice because internally they feel unheard or powerless. They attack because pain often disguises itself as aggression. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew that emotionally reactive people are usually suffering internally, even when they appear dominant on the surface. Anger often looks powerful, but underneath it there is usually fear, insecurity, frustration, or wounded pride struggling for protection. That perspective changes the emotional atmosphere of conflict completely. Instead of seeing arguments as opportunities to defeat someone, you begin recognizing them as moments where emotional instability is revealing itself openly. Once you begin seeing arguments through that lens, something shifts internally. Conflict starts losing its emotional appeal, not because you become passive, but because you realize how exhausting emotionally reactive conversations actually are. Most arguments solve very little. They simply create temporary emotional release while damaging peace in the process. People leave the conversation feeling justified for a moment, but afterward the mind continues replaying everything that was said. The nervous system remains tense. Pride keeps searching for better responses hours later. Even when someone technically wins the argument, they often lose emotional stability afterward. That is why inner discipline matters so much during conflict. The real challenge is not controlling the other person. The real challenge is maintaining awareness while your own emotions are pulling you toward reaction. It takes very little skill to become emotionally loud. Almost anyone can react impulsively when angry, but remaining calm while being misunderstood requires strength. Most people never fully develop, especially when pride feels wounded, especially when the ego desperately wants to defend itself. Those moments expose whether someone is truly grounded internally or simply calm when conditions are comfortable. There is also a strange emptiness hidden inside the need to always be right. Many people spend years trying to win conversations without realizing how much peace it costs them. They cannot let misunderstandings go. They feel compelled to correct every opinion, defend every criticism, and respond to every challenge. Over time, life becomes emotionally heavy because the mind never fully rests. Everything feels personal. Every interaction carries emotional weight, and eventually the nervous system becomes addicted to tension without realizing it. Conflict becomes familiar, even when it is destructive. The Stoics practiced something very different. They trained themselves to separate emotional impulse from conscious response. They understood that another person's lack of self-control does not require you to lose yours as well. That awareness creates enormous freedom because it breaks the cycle of emotional mirroring. Most people unconsciously absorb and reflect the emotional energy around them. Anger produces anger. Defensiveness creates defensiveness. But a disciplined mind interrupts that chain reaction. Instead of immediately matching someone else's intensity, you pause long enough to choose your response deliberately. This does not mean silence in every situation. Some conversations matter deeply. Some boundaries must be expressed clearly. But there is a difference between speaking from clarity and speaking from emotional chaos. One creates understanding. The other usually creates more damage. And often the strongest response is not louder words but calm presence. A person who stays emotionally centered during conflict quietly shifts the entire energy of the interaction. They become difficult to manipulate because they are no longer reacting automatically. Over time, this awareness changes the way you move through life completely. You stop viewing every disagreement as something you must conquer. You stop wasting energy trying to force people to understand you perfectly. And strangely enough, the less desperate you become to win emotionally reactive conversations, the more peaceful your mind begins to feel. Arguments lose their addictive pull because you finally recognize the hidden cost behind them. The temporary satisfaction of proving yourself rarely compares to the lasting stability that comes from protecting your inner state instead. That is where real maturity begins, not in controlling others, but in refusing to let someone else's emotional instability decide your own behavior. Because once you understand that peace is more valuable than victory, the entire purpose of conflict begins changing internally. There is a reason emotionally grounded people rarely feel the need to dominate a room. They are not trying to convince everyone of their intelligence, their value, or their strength, because internally they are no longer depending on constant external confirmation to feel secure. Most loud behavior comes from internal instability. The endless need to prove, explain, defend, and correct usually hides insecurity more than confidence. Truly centered people move differently. They speak when necessary, but they are not emotionally desperate to control every perception others have of them. That desperation disappears once identity becomes rooted internally instead of externally. Many people mistake silence for weakness because they were taught that strength must always announce itself loudly. They believe the strongest person is the one who wins the argument, gets the final word, or dominates the conversation. But real self-control often looks quiet from the outside. It appears in the ability to remain calm while being misunderstood. It appears in the discipline to walk away from pointless conflict without needing emotional revenge. That kind of restraint confuses emotionally reactive people because they expect resistance, defensiveness, and escalation. When those reactions never arrive, they lose the emotional control they were unconsciously trying to gain. This is why calmness can feel so powerful in difficult situations. Not performative calmness, not silence used as manipulation, genuine inner steadiness, the kind that does not rush to defend itself because it no longer feels threatened by every opinion. Epictetus understood this deeply when he taught that if someone speaks badly about you, live in such a way that nobody believes them. There is enormous freedom hidden inside that perspective. Instead of obsessing over correcting every misunderstanding, you focus your energy on your actual character. You stop managing appearances so aggressively because you realize that integrity speaks more consistently than explanation ever will. Most people waste tremendous emotional energy trying to control narratives they cannot fully control anyway. They replay conversations in their minds, searching for better responses. They obsess over what someone thinks about them. They feel panic when misunderstood because they believe misunderstanding somehow diminishes their worth. But no amount of explaining can fully control another person's perception. People see through the lens of their own beliefs, insecurities, experiences, and emotional state. Some people will misunderstand you no matter how clearly you communicate. Some people will project their own pain onto you, no matter how patient you remain. Fighting endlessly against that reality creates exhaustion more than peace. The stronger someone becomes internally, the less they feel compelled to chase emotional validation externally. This does not mean they stop caring completely about others. It means they stop making their emotional stability dependent on constant approval. That distinction changes everything. When someone criticizes them unfairly, they no longer collapse internally because their identity is not built entirely on outside opinion. When someone attempts to provoke them emotionally, they pause long enough to recognize that another person's emotional chaos does not require participation. That awareness creates a kind of psychological freedom that emotionally reactive people rarely experience. People who thrive on conflict often become uncomfortable around emotionally disciplined individuals because emotional discipline cannot be manipulated easily. Reactive people unconsciously expect certain patterns. They expect anger to create anger, defensiveness to create defensiveness, insults to trigger emotional retaliation. When those patterns fail to appear, the entire emotional dynamic changes. Calmness interrupts manipulation because manipulation depends on predictable emotional reaction. A person capable of maintaining inner steadiness becomes difficult to control precisely because they are no longer reacting automatically. This does not mean becoming emotionally distant or detached from life. In fact, it often creates deeper awareness. You begin noticing how many conversations are fueled by ego rather than truth. You notice how often people are trying to protect emotional wounds rather than genuinely communicate. Someone interrupts because they fear being ignored. Someone exaggerates because they fear insignificance. Someone attacks because internally they feel powerless. Once you see this clearly, compassion naturally increases even while maintaining strong boundaries. You stop taking every interaction personally because you recognize how much of human behavior is shaped by unresolved inner struggle. At the same time, something important begins changing inside your own mind. Silence stops feeling uncomfortable. You no longer experience immediate urgency to defend yourself against every accusation or misunderstanding. The ego still reacts. Sometimes, of course, the desire to explain or correct does not disappear overnight, but awareness grows stronger than impulse. Instead of immediate following emotional urges, you begin observing them. You notice the need to prove yourself before acting on it. That observation weakens the compulsion gradually, and over time your nervous system becomes calmer, because it is no longer constantly fighting for emotional control in every interaction. There is also a quiet confidence that develops when your actions begin aligning consistently with your values. You stop needing people to constantly reassure you about who you are, because you already know internally whether your behavior reflects integrity or not. That self-respect creates stability, and stability changes the energy you bring into conversations completely. You become less reactive, less defensive, and far less emotionally desperate. Other people can sense that, without you needing to announce it. Presence communicates more powerfully than performance ever could. Ironically, the less someone feels the need to prove themselves, the stronger they often appear. People naturally trust calmness more than emotional chaos. They feel safer around individuals who are not constantly trying to dominate or defend themselves. There is something deeply grounding about a person who remains composed without becoming cold, someone who listens without immediately attacking, someone who does not turn every disagreement into an emotional battle. That kind of discipline quietly changes the atmosphere around them, because steadiness influences people more deeply than force usually does. And eventually you realize something most people spend years overlooking. The final word rarely creates peace. Winning every argument rarely creates fulfillment. Constantly defending your image rarely creates stability, but protecting your inner state does. Choosing clarity over ego does. Remaining emotionally grounded while the world around you pulls toward reaction does, because the strongest presence in the room is often the one that no longer needs to prove its strength at all. One of the biggest misunderstandings about emotional control is the belief that calmness means feeling nothing. Many people hear ideas about discipline, restraint, and inner peace, then immediately imagine someone emotionally cold, disconnected, or detached from human experience entirely. But that was never the point. The Stoics did not teach people to destroy emotion. They taught people not to become enslaved by it. There is a profound difference between suppressing emotion and understanding it. Suppression forces emotion into the background, while it quietly continues shaping behavior from underneath. Discipline allows emotion to exist without immediately surrendering control to it. This distinction matters more than most people realize, because many emotionally reactive individuals are not actually expressing emotion honestly. They are being controlled by impulses they never learned how to observe properly. Anger rises and they instantly obey it. Hurt appears and they immediately seek escape, revenge, distraction, or validation. Fear surfaces and the nervous system begins reacting before awareness even has time to step in. Over time, this creates the illusion that emotions are uncontrollable forces rather than internal experiences that can be witnessed consciously. But emotions lose much of their dominance once observation becomes stronger than impulse. That observation begins with something very small, a pause, not a dramatic pause, just a moment of awareness before reaction fully takes over. Someone says something disrespectful, and instead of immediately responding, you notice the reaction forming internally. You notice tension in the body. You notice the ego preparing its defense. You notice anger beginning to rise before words leave your mouth. For most people, this process happens too quickly to recognize because they have spent years reacting automatically. But once awareness enters the moment, emotional energy starts changing shape. You stop becoming fully identified with the reaction itself. This is where real freedom quietly begins. Not in controlling the outside world, but in learning that emotions do not have to dictate behavior automatically. You can feel anger without becoming destructive. You can feel disappointment without collapsing internally. You can feel hurt without immediately trying to punish someone emotionally. The feeling itself is not the problem. The unconscious obedience to it is what creates suffering. Stoic discipline was never about pretending painful emotions do not exist. It was about refusing to let temporary emotional states become permanent masters over the mind. Many people avoid this kind of awareness because observing emotion honestly can feel uncomfortable at first. It forces you to confront parts of yourself that are usually hidden beneath reaction. Pride, fear, insecurity, loneliness, emotional dependence. Sometimes anger is easier than vulnerability because anger creates the temporary illusion of strength. But beneath many emotional outbursts is often a quieter fear struggling to protect itself. Someone feels ignored, unimportant, rejected, or misunderstood, and the nervous system transforms that pain into defensiveness or aggression, because those reactions feel safer than direct honesty. The Stoics understood that emotional maturity requires courage precisely because it asks people to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it immediately. Most modern behavior is built around avoidance. People distract themselves constantly because stillness forces self-awareness. They rush toward reaction because reaction temporarily relieves emotional pressure. But relief is not the same thing as peace. Emotional release may feel satisfying for a moment, yet afterward the mind often becomes heavier, not lighter. Words spoken impulsively cannot always be taken back. Reactions driven by emotion often leave regret once clarity returns. This is why the pause matters so much. Inside that pause, the emotional storm loses some of its authority. Breathing deeply during tension may sound simple, but psychologically it changes the entire experience. Instead of becoming consumed by the reaction, you begin creating distance from it. You become the observer rather than the emotion itself. That shift is subtle but powerful. The anger is still present, but now awareness exists alongside it. And once awareness is present, choice becomes possible again. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly within his own mind. He reminded himself that emotions are natural, but surrendering reason completely to emotion creates unnecessary suffering. He understood that difficult moments reveal the condition of the mind more clearly than comfortable ones ever could. Anyone can appear calm when life feels easy, but emotional discipline becomes visible when frustration, criticism, rejection, or disrespect enters the situation. Those moments expose whether awareness is truly present, or whether emotion still controls behavior automatically. Over time, practicing this kind of observation changes the nervous system itself. Emotional reactions begin slowing down, not because you stop caring, but because you stop panicking every time discomfort appears internally. You become less afraid of your own emotions. And strangely enough, the less afraid you become of emotion, the less control it tends to have over you. Fear amplifies emotional intensity. Awareness softens it. A person constantly resisting emotion often becomes consumed by it indirectly. A person capable of calmly observing emotion develops far greater internal stability. This does not make life emotionless. You still feel deeply. You still experience sadness, frustration, excitement, disappointment, and joy. But your relationship with those emotions changes fundamentally. They become experiences moving through you, rather than identities controlling you. That distinction creates enormous psychological freedom. because you stop treating every emotional impulse as absolute truth. Sometimes the mind exaggerates danger. Sometimes the ego creates offense where none truly exists. Sometimes temporary emotion distorts perception completely. Awareness allows those distortions to settle before they become destructive actions, and eventually something begins changing quietly inside your daily life. Conversations feel lighter because you are no longer reacting automatically to every emotional shift. Conflict loses some of its emotional grip because you recognize the difference between feeling emotion and becoming ruled by it. The mind becomes calmer, not because life suddenly stops testing you, but because you finally understand that emotional discipline is not about suppressing your humanity. It is about learning how to remain present within it without losing yourself every time emotion rises. Most people live as if every emotion arriving inside them must immediately become action. Anger appears, and they react. Offense rises, and they defend themselves. Jealousy appears, and comparison quietly takes over the mind. There is almost no space between feeling and behavior. The emotional impulse arrives, and the person obeys it automatically, without questioning whether the reaction is useful, truthful, or even necessary. Over time, this creates a life driven more by emotional reflex than conscious awareness. The mind becomes conditioned to follow every internal wave the moment it appears, and eventually people stop realizing they even have a choice. This is why emotional maturity feels so rare. It requires something most people never practice consistently: the ability to separate emotion from identity. Just because anger rises inside you does not mean anger deserves control over your words. Just because you feel hurt does not mean the situation truly threatens your worth. Emotions are real experiences, but they are not always accurate interpreters of reality. Sometimes they are simply echoes of fear, insecurity, exhaustion, pride, or old emotional conditioning resurfacing through new situations. Without awareness, people mistake emotional intensity for truth itself. The Stoics understood this clearly. They did not believe emotions should be denied or buried beneath forced positivity. They understood that human beings naturally experience emotional reactions, but they also believed that wisdom begins the moment a person stops blindly surrendering to those reactions. Epictetus often reminded himself that people are disturbed not by events but by their judgments about events. That distinction changes everything because it places responsibility back into awareness rather than impulse. It means the feeling itself is not the final authority. Interpretation matters. Perspective matters. Conscious response matters. Think about how often emotional reactions create consequences far larger than the original situation ever deserved. A single moment of anger damages years of trust. One impulsive sentence destroys a meaningful connection. An emotional decision made in frustration creates regret that lasts far longer than the feeling itself. Most people recognize this only afterward, once the emotional intensity fades and clarity quietly returns. In calmer moments, they suddenly realize they were not responding to reality clearly at all. They were reacting through emotion without awareness guiding the process. This is why self-observation becomes so important. Emotional discipline does not begin by controlling feelings perfectly. It begins by noticing them honestly. You notice how quickly the ego wants to defend itself during criticism. You notice the immediate urge to prove yourself when feeling misunderstood. You notice how offense creates tension in the body before a single word is spoken. That awareness interrupts the automatic cycle. Instead of immediately becoming the emotion, you begin witnessing it while it unfolds. And strangely enough, the moment you observe emotion clearly, some of its control weakens automatically. Many people fear this kind of pause because reacting instantly feels powerful in the moment. Anger creates energy. Defensiveness creates temporary certainty. Emotional reactions often provide immediate psychological relief because they release tension outward. But relief and wisdom are not always the same thing. Some reactions feel satisfying temporarily, while quietly damaging peace, relationships, and self-respect underneath. A person who cannot pause before reacting becomes emotionally predictable. Their buttons are easy to press because their nervous system responds automatically to external stimulation. The stronger the emotional reaction, the more important awareness becomes. This is something emotionally reactive people rarely understand. They assume intense emotion justifies immediate action, but often the opposite is true. Intense emotions are usually the moments where slowing down matters most. A calm mind sees more clearly than an emotionally flooded one. The goal was never emotional suppression. The goal was clarity strong enough to remain present even while emotion moved through the mind. Over time, this changes the way you experience conflict completely. Someone says something disrespectful, and instead of immediately escalating the situation, you notice the emotional reaction internally before acting on it. Someone criticizes you unfairly, and instead of instantly defending yourself, you allow space for reflection first. Sometimes the criticism contains truth. Sometimes it reveals more about the other person than about you. But reacting impulsively rarely allows enough stillness to recognize the difference clearly. Awareness creates that stillness. This does not make you passive. It makes you deliberate. There is a difference. Passive people avoid confrontation because they fear discomfort. Emotionally disciplined people choose their responses carefully because they value clarity more than impulse. Sometimes silence becomes the strongest response. Sometimes calm communication becomes necessary. Sometimes walking away protects peace better than proving a point ever could. Awareness allows these decisions to emerge consciously rather than emotionally, and gradually something deeper begins changing internally. The mind stops feeling constantly dragged around by every passing emotion. Offense loses some of its power because you no longer assume every emotional reaction deserves immediate expression. Anger still appears sometimes. Of course, disappointment still exists. Hurt still exists. But those emotions stop becoming commands. They become experiences you can observe without instantly surrendering your behavior to them. That distinction creates enormous freedom because it places awareness back at the center of your life. Most people spend years trying to control the outside world while remaining strangers to their own inner reactions. They blame situations, people, and circumstances for their emotional state without recognizing how often suffering is intensified by unconscious obedience to temporary feelings. But emotional maturity changes that relationship slowly. You stop asking whether the emotion feels strong and start asking whether the emotion deserves control over your actions. That single shift transforms the mind completely, because wisdom begins the moment awareness becomes stronger than impulse. There is a certain heaviness that emotionally reactive people carry through life, even when nothing dramatic is happening around them. Their body may be sitting quietly in a room, but internally, the mind is still fighting conversations that ended hours ago. They replay arguments repeatedly, imagining better responses, sharper comebacks, different outcomes. A single comment follows them through the entire day. One moment of disrespect lingers in the nervous system long after the situation itself has disappeared. And over time, this constant internal conflict becomes exhausting because the mind never truly rests. Even in silence, tension continues moving beneath the surface. Most people do not realize how much energy emotional reactivity consumes until they begin observing it honestly. The reaction itself may last only a few seconds outwardly, but internally, it creates psychological loops that continue long afterward. Someone criticizes them, and now the mind keeps revisiting the moment over and over again. Someone behaves unfairly and resentment quietly follows them into the evening. They wake up the next day emotionally heavy, not because life is constantly attacking them, but because the mind has not fully released the emotional charge from previous experiences. The body leaves the conversation, but the nervous system keeps reliving it. This is one of the hidden costs of unconscious reaction. It does not simply disturb peace temporarily. It trains the mind to remain emotionally entangled with external circumstances constantly. Small inconveniences become emotionally significant. Delays create irritation. Disrespect creates obsession. Disappointment becomes personal. And gradually a person begins living at the mercy of outside conditions without even noticing it. Their emotional state changes depending on traffic, moods, opinions, social media comments, messages, attention and approval. Peace becomes unstable because it depends entirely on life remaining favorable. The Stoics warned against this kind of dependence because they understood how fragile it makes the mind. A person who cannot maintain internal steadiness without perfect external conditions will suffer constantly in ordinary life. Human beings are imperfect. Situations become frustrating. Misunderstandings happen. Delays happen. Criticism happens. Disrespect happens. If every uncomfortable experience gains the power to disturb your inner world deeply, emotional exhaustion becomes unavoidable. And many people are living in exactly that state without understanding why they feel so mentally drained all the time. Part of the problem is that reactive thinking feeds itself endlessly. The more attention the mind gives emotional conflict, the stronger it becomes internally. One irritated thought leads to another. Resentment grows through repetition. The nervous system keeps reliving emotional pain because the mind continues rehearsing it unconsciously. This is why emotionally reactive people often feel trapped inside cycles they cannot escape. They believe the original situation is causing their suffering, when in reality, much of the suffering is being recreated continuously through mental repetition. The event may have lasted minutes. The mind keeps extending it for days. Marcus Aurelius understood how dangerous this habit could become. He constantly reminded himself not to carry unnecessary emotional weight through the mind. He recognized that external events only gain lasting control when the mind continues feeding them internally. Most people never develop this awareness because they assume thinking endlessly about a problem somehow gives them control over it. But often the opposite happens. Endless mental replay deepens emotional attachment rather than resolving it. The mind becomes trapped inside loops of anger, resentment, and imagined conflict, without reaching peace or clarity. This is why emotional discipline creates such profound relief once practiced consistently. It interrupts those cycles before they fully consume the mind. Someone says something hurtful, and instead of replaying the moment for the next 12 hours, you allow the emotional wave to settle naturally without continuously feeding it through thought. Someone behaves unfairly, and instead of mentally fighting the situation all night, you recognize that carrying the conflict internally only extends the suffering. This does not mean pretending painful situations do not matter. It means refusing to let them dominate your inner state endlessly. There is also something psychologically freeing about realizing that not every emotional reaction deserves your ongoing attention. Many people unknowingly strengthen negative emotional patterns simply by rehearsing them constantly. The mind becomes conditioned toward irritation because irritation receives so much focus. Resentment grows because it is repeatedly revisited. Anxiety deepens because imagined scenarios are replayed endlessly. Awareness breaks this pattern by shifting attention away from emotional obsession and back toward conscious presence. At first, this can feel unfamiliar because many people are emotionally addicted to internal conflict without realizing it. The mind becomes accustomed to tension, analysis, and emotional rehearsal. Stillness feels uncomfortable because it removes distraction. But over time, practicing awareness changes the nervous system slowly. Emotional situations still happen, but they stop dominating your internal world completely. Thoughts come and go without immediately trapping you inside them. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer constantly feeding emotional disturbances through repetition. This changes daily life in subtle but powerful ways. Delays stop ruining your entire mood. Criticism no longer occupies your thoughts for days. A stranger's behavior stops determining your emotional condition. You begin protecting your attention more carefully because you realize attention shapes emotional experience profoundly. Whatever the mind repeatedly focuses on grows stronger internally. The Stoics understood this long before modern psychology explained it. Peace is not simply the absence of difficulty. It is the ability to stop giving every external event permanent residence inside your mind. And eventually, you notice something surprising. Life itself may not become easier externally, but internally there is far less emotional noise. The nervous system relaxes because it is no longer carrying every irritation, resentment, or disappointment from one moment into the next. Conversations end without endless replay. Conflict passes without emotional obsession. The mind becomes lighter because awareness finally interrupts the endless loops that once consumed so much energy. And inside that quietness, peace no longer feels temporary. It begins feeling stable. There comes a moment where the mind begins craving something deeper than temporary emotional victories. Arguments stop feeling satisfying. Defending yourself constantly becomes exhausting. The endless cycle of reacting, regretting, replaying and recovering starts feeling heavy in a way that is difficult to explain. And slowly, another possibility begins appearing internally. The possibility of remaining calm even when the world around you is not. The possibility of hearing criticism without collapsing emotionally. The possibility of standing in the middle of tension without allowing someone else's emotional state to become your own. At first, that kind of steadiness seems almost impossible because most people were conditioned to believe reaction equals strength. They were taught that silence means weakness, restraint means passivity, and emotional intensity means authenticity. Someone insults you, and the expectation is immediate retaliation. Someone disrespects you, and the ego demands a response strong enough to restore pride instantly. Entire cultures reinforce this pattern constantly. People admire emotional dominance because it looks powerful externally. But very few people stop to examine what happens internally afterward. The anger lingers, the nervous system stays activated. Peace disappears long after the moment itself ends. Real strength feels very different from emotional reaction. It does not rush. It does not panic. It does not desperately seek control over every conversation or every opinion. Real strength remains centered even while emotion is present. That is what makes it so difficult to develop. Remaining calm during peaceful moments requires very little discipline. Remaining calm while someone attempts to provoke insecurity, pride or anger requires awareness most people never fully cultivate. The nervous system wants immediate release. The ego wants defense. The mind wants victory. But awareness quietly asks a different question. Is losing your peace worth proving a point? That question changes everything because it shifts the focus inward instead of outward. Most reactive behavior is fueled by the unconscious belief that emotional retaliation protects identity, but often it does the opposite. A person fully controlled by external behavior becomes emotionally fragile without realizing it. Their state of mind rises and falls according to what other people say, think, or do. One comment creates anger. One criticism creates insecurity. One disagreement creates emotional tension lasting for hours. The outside world begins controlling the inner world completely. The Stoics understood how dangerous that dependency could become. They knew that emotional freedom begins the moment a person stops allowing every external event to dictate their internal condition. That does not mean painful situations suddenly stop existing. Criticism still happens. Disrespect still happens. Betrayal still happens. But the relationship with those experiences changes when awareness becomes stronger than impulse. Instead of immediately absorbing emotional energy from every situation, you begin observing it without surrendering yourself to it completely. There is something deeply powerful about observing emotional chaos without becoming emotionally chaotic yourself. Someone raises their voice but you remain steady. Someone tries to provoke guilt, anger or defensiveness, but internally you stay aware of what is happening instead of unconsciously mirroring their behavior. This kind of stillness unsettles reactive people because they expect emotional participation. Most conflict survives through mutual escalation. Anger feeds anger. Defensiveness feeds defensiveness. Emotional intensity spreads quickly between people who are not fully aware of themselves, but calmness interrupts that cycle. Not forced calmness, genuine internal steadiness, the kind that comes from no longer needing emotional victory in every interaction. This is why restraint feels so strong once understood properly. Restraint is not weakness hiding from confrontation. It is awareness choosing clarity over impulse. Sometimes the strongest response is silence, because silence protects peace, where reaction would only extend suffering. Sometimes the strongest response is calm honesty, without emotional aggression attached to it. And sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to carry another person's emotional instability into your own mind. This awareness changes the way you experience criticism as well. Most people hear criticism and immediately treat it like a threat to identity. But emotionally grounded individuals approach it differently. They listen carefully, without instantly collapsing into defensiveness. If the criticism contains truth, they learn from it. If it comes from projection, insecurity or misunderstanding, they allow it to pass without internalizing it completely. That balance creates enormous psychological stability, because self-worth is no longer entirely controlled by external opinion. Over time, this discipline reshapes the nervous system itself. Emotional triggers lose some of their intensity, because the mind no longer reacts automatically to every disturbance. Space appears between stimulus and response. Thoughts slow down. Awareness strengthens. Situations that once created immediate emotional overwhelm begin losing their control gradually. The world may remain chaotic externally, but internally something steadier begins forming beneath the surface. And strangely enough, the calmer you become, the more clearly you start seeing other people. You notice how much emotional behavior is driven by fear, insecurity, loneliness, and unresolved pain. You notice how often aggression hides weakness rather than strength. Compassion begins replacing some of the anger, because understanding creates distance from emotional personalization. You stop viewing every difficult interaction as a personal attack against your worth. That does not make you passive. It makes you grounded. There is a difference. Grounded people still protect boundaries. They still speak truth when necessary, but they are no longer emotionally consumed by every challenge life presents. Their stability comes from within, rather than from controlling everyone around them, and eventually that steadiness becomes more valuable than winning arguments ever was, because the ability to remain centered while chaos invites you into emotional warfare is one of the rarest forms of strength a person can develop. The ego feeds on conflict more than most people realize. It searches constantly for proof of importance, superiority, recognition and control. That is why emotionally reactive moments can feel strangely addictive in the beginning. Anger creates intensity. Defensiveness creates temporary certainty. Winning an argument creates a short-lived feeling of dominance that the ego immediately mistakes for strength. In those moments, emotional reaction feels powerful because it gives the illusion of control, but that feeling never lasts very long. Once the emotional intensity fades, exhaustion usually follows behind it. The nervous system becomes heavy. Regret quietly appears. Relationships feel strained. Peace disappears. And still many people repeat the same cycle over and over again, because they confuse emotional intensity with inner power. This is one of the reasons anger can become psychologically seductive. For a brief moment it silences deeper feelings of insecurity, vulnerability or helplessness. A person who feels emotionally wounded may suddenly feel strong while expressing rage because anger temporarily masks emotional pain beneath force. But underneath that reaction, the original insecurity still exists untouched. Nothing was truly resolved internally. The emotion simply created enough noise to distract from what was happening underneath. That is why reactive people often remain trapped inside repetitive cycles. They keep searching for emotional release without realizing that release is not the same thing as freedom. The Stoics understood this distinction clearly. They knew uncontrolled anger does not strengthen the mind, it weakens it. A person ruled entirely by emotional impulses becomes easy to influence because their internal state depends completely on external conditions. Someone insults them and their peace disappears. Someone criticizes them and their identity begins shaking. Someone behaves unfairly and suddenly the mind becomes consumed with resentment. Emotional dependence gives enormous power to outside circumstances because the inner world loses its stability every time life becomes uncomfortable. Most people never notice how much emotional control they hand away throughout ordinary life. A stranger's opinion changes their mood, delay create frustration strong enough to ruin entire evenings. A disagreement follows them mentally for hours after the conversation ends. Their emotional state becomes shaped constantly by things they cannot fully control, and because this pattern feels normal, they rarely question it. They assume emotional reactivity is simply part of being human, but the Stoics believed human beings are capable of something much deeper than automatic reaction. They believed awareness could become stronger than impulse. That process begins by recognizing how often the ego secretly drives emotional behavior. The ego wants to feel important. It wants acknowledgement. It wants reassurance that it matters. That is why criticism often feels disproportionately painful. The reaction is not only about the words themselves. The ego hears criticism as a threat to identity, and once identity feels threatened, the nervous system immediately moves toward defense. Sometimes that defense appears as anger. Sometimes it appears as withdrawal, passive aggression, or emotional shutdown. But underneath all of it is usually the same fear, the fear of losing worth, control, or significance. There is something humbling about seeing this clearly within yourself. It becomes harder to judge others harshly once you realize how much of human behavior is driven by unconscious emotional protection. People attack because they feel insecure. They dominate because they fear insignificance. They seek constant validation because internally they feel unstable. Even arrogance is often insecurity wearing armor. The ego creates endless strategies to avoid vulnerability, because vulnerability feels dangerous to an unexamined mind. But no amount of emotional defense creates genuine peace internally. In moments of anger, people often believe they are seeing clearly when they are actually reacting through wounded pride. The mind narrows, compassion disappears, nuance disappears, everything becomes emotionally charged. This is why reactive people often say things they later regret deeply once calmness returns. During emotional intensity, the ego convinces them the reaction is justified. Only afterward does awareness quietly reveal the damage that was created. The deeper someone becomes trapped in ego-driven living, the more emotionally fragile they often become. Their sense of self depends heavily on external agreement and favorable conditions. They need respect. Constantly they need approval. Constantly they need to feel admired or understood in order to remain emotionally stable. And because the outside world can never fully provide permanent validation, the mind remains restless. There is always another conflict, another insecurity, another emotional disturbance waiting to threaten inner peace. Again, this is why Stoic discipline feels so liberating once practiced consistently. It slowly weakens the ego's need for constant emotional victory. You stop chasing superiority in every conversation. You stop feeling compelled to prove yourself constantly. The desire for emotional domination begins losing its grip because you recognize the hidden exhaustion behind it. Protecting peace becomes more valuable than protecting pride. Clarity becomes more important than winning. And strangely enough, the less attached you become to external validation, the stronger your inner state begins to feel naturally. That strength is quieter than ego-driven power. It does not need to announce itself aggressively. It does not collapse when challenged. It remains steady because it is rooted internally rather than externally. A person ruled by ego constantly fears losing status, approval, or control. A person grounded in awareness becomes far less emotionally dependent on those things. Criticism may still sting sometimes. Disrespect may still feel unpleasant, but those experiences stop controlling the entire emotional condition of the mind. Over time, the nervous system becomes calmer because life is no longer experienced as a constant battle for emotional survival. The ego still exists. Of course, pride still appears sometimes. Anger still rises occasionally, but awareness stops those emotions from becoming absolute rulers over behavior. That changes relationships, conversations, and internal peace in profound ways. You begin responding more consciously instead of reacting automatically. Emotional situations stop pulling you completely out of yourself. And eventually you realize something the Stoics understood centuries ago. Real freedom is not controlling other people. It is no longer being controlled by your own unexamined emotional impulses. Because the moment anger owns your mind completely, your peace no longer belongs to you. There is another layer to emotional reaction that many people spend years overlooking. Sometimes the present moment is not the real source of the pain at all. The situation happening now simply touches something much older beneath the surface. A person ignores you for a few hours, and suddenly the feeling is far heavier than the situation logically deserves. Someone criticizes your work, and the reaction feels intensely personal. Someone becomes distant, and fear immediately rises before any real explanation even exists. On the surface, it appears the present situation created the emotional response. But often the present moment is only reopening emotional patterns that were never fully understood or healed in the first place. This is why reactions can sometimes feel strangely disproportionate. The mind responds not only to what is happening now, but to everything the current moment unconsciously reminds it of. One experience becomes emotionally connected to many older experiences beneath awareness. A small rejection awakens old feelings of abandonment. A disagreement awakens old memories of feeling unheard. Criticism awakens long-standing insecurities about worth or adequacy. The nervous system reacts with intensity because internally it is not responding to one moment alone. It is responding to years of accumulated emotional memory layered underneath the present situation. Carl Jung understood this deeply when he spoke about psychological projection and self-awareness. He believed that emotional triggers often reveal hidden aspects of ourselves that remain unresolved internally. People usually think the trigger itself is the enemy. They focus entirely on the person, the comment, or the situation that disturbed them. But sometimes the deeper issue is not what happened externally. The deeper issue is why the situation gained such emotional power internally. That is where real understanding begins, not by obsessing over every trigger outside yourself, but by becoming curious about what those triggers reveal within you. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first because it shifts responsibility inward. It is easier to blame another person completely than to examine why certain words affect you so deeply. But awareness grows through honesty, not avoidance. Someone else may absolutely behave unfairly, disrespectfully, or carelessly. That part can still be true. Yet emotional maturity asks an additional question beyond external blame. Why did this situation shake my inner state so intensely? That question changes the direction of growth entirely because it moves attention from reaction towards self-understanding. Many people spend years trying to eliminate every external trigger from life without realizing that the real vulnerability exists internally. They try to control people, conversations, outcomes, and opinions because they believe external control will finally create emotional safety. But life will always contain uncomfortable moments. Misunderstandings will happen, criticism will happen, rejection will happen. If unresolved emotional wounds remain unconscious, those experiences will continue activating the same painful reactions repeatedly, no matter how carefully someone tries to protect themselves externally. This is why emotionally reactive patterns often repeat across completely different situations. The details change, but the emotional experience remains strangely familiar. A person may feel rejected in friendships, relationships, workplaces, and conversations in similar ways because the deeper wound is traveling with them internally. The outside world simply keeps activating what already exists beneath awareness. Until that pattern is understood consciously, the same emotional cycle continues repeating itself through different people and different circumstances. The Stoics approach this reality differently than most people do today. Instead of seeing discomfort as something purely negative, they often viewed it as an opportunity for awareness. Difficult emotions became signals revealing where attachment, fear, insecurity, or dependence existed internally. That perspective transforms emotional triggers from enemies into teachers. The discomfort itself becomes information, not pleasant information, but valuable information. A person who becomes offended easily may discover hidden attachment to approval. A person consumed by criticism may uncover deeper insecurity about identity. A person unable to tolerate rejection may realize how much emotional worth has been placed in external validation. This kind of self-examination requires patience because the mind naturally resists looking inward honestly. The ego prefers focusing on other people's flaws rather than confronting its own unresolved pain. Blaming others protects identity temporarily. Self-awareness challenges it. But without that deeper awareness, emotional reactions continue controlling behavior unconsciously. The same triggers keep appearing because the underlying wound remains untouched beneath the surface. There is also something freeing about understanding that emotional triggers do not necessarily define weakness. They reveal humanity. Everyone carries emotional history. Everyone has fears, insecurities, and unresolved experiences shaping perception in ways they may not fully recognize yet. The difference is that emotionally mature people gradually become willing to observe those patterns instead of constantly projecting them outward onto the world around them. Awareness interrupts repetition. Without awareness, old wounds quietly continue directing emotional behavior from behind the scenes. Over time, this understanding softens the relationship with emotional discomfort itself. Instead of immediately reacting against every painful feeling, you begin observing what the feeling might be revealing internally. Anger becomes information. Defensiveness becomes information. Jealousy becomes information. None of these emotions need to become identities. They become opportunities for deeper understanding if approached consciously rather than reactively. This changes relationships profoundly because you stop expecting other people to heal emotional wounds they never created. You stop placing impossible responsibility on external situations to repair internal insecurity completely, and slowly emotional freedom begins growing from within, rather than depending entirely on what happens outside you. The world still contains difficult people and painful experiences, but those moments no longer control the mind as completely because awareness now exists alongside the reaction itself. And eventually something deeper becomes clear. The trigger was never only about the present moment. It was revealing parts of yourself that still needed understanding, compassion, and healing beneath the surface. Once you recognize that, Emotional reactions stop being random interruptions to peace. They become mirrors, reflecting where awareness still has room to grow. Once awareness begins deepening, conflict no longer feels as simple as it once did. Before self-observation enters the picture, most people experience arguments through a very narrow lens. Someone says something painful, and the mind immediately decides the other person is entirely responsible for the emotional reaction that follows. Attention moves outward automatically. Blame becomes immediate. Defensiveness appears without reflection. But the moment awareness becomes stronger, something subtle starts changing internally. Instead of reacting instantly, the mind pauses long enough to examine itself as well as the situation. That pause creates an entirely different relationship with emotional discomfort. Instead of asking only why did they do this, another question quietly appears beneath the surface. Why did this affect me so deeply? At first that question can feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that emotional suffering comes only from outside circumstances. It asks for honesty rather than blame, and honesty requires courage because it forces people to confront parts of themselves they usually avoid. Examining closely pride, fear, emotional dependence, the desperate need to feel validated, respected or understood by everyone around them. Many people spend years believing emotional freedom will come through controlling others more effectively. They try to control opinions, conversations, perceptions and outcomes. They explain themselves endlessly, hoping to eliminate misunderstanding completely. They defend themselves constantly, hoping criticism will finally disappear. But external control never creates lasting peace, because human beings are unpredictable by nature. No amount of effort can guarantee that everyone will understand you correctly, treat you fairly, or respond with emotional maturity at all times. Trying to control those things eventually creates exhaustion more than stability. This is where deeper self-awareness changes everything. You begin realizing that emotional suffering often grows strongest where internal attachment already exists. If criticism destroys your peace completely, there may be attachment to approval underneath it. If rejection creates overwhelming panic, there may be dependence on external validation beneath the surface. If disrespect instantly creates rage, perhaps identity has become too dependent on how others perceive you. These realizations are not meant to create shame, they create clarity. And clarity is what allows real growth to begin. The Stoics believed that the quality of your inner world matters more than your ability to manage external circumstances perfectly. That idea sounds simple until life becomes emotionally difficult. Someone misunderstands you publicly. Someone questions your character unfairly. Someone withholds the recognition you believed you deserved. In those moments, the ego desperately wants to regain control externally. It wants validation restored immediately. It wants the discomfort removed as quickly as possible. But awareness asks something different. What exactly inside me feels threatened right now? That question shifts attention inward in a way most people are not accustomed to. Instead of becoming consumed entirely by another person's behavior, you begin observing your own emotional patterns more carefully. Sometimes the answer reveals insecurity. Sometimes it reveals fear of rejection. Sometimes it reveals how much self-worth has quietly become attached to external approval. None of this is easy to admit at first, because the ego prefers appearing strong rather than vulnerable. But avoiding self-awareness only guarantees the same emotional cycles continue repeating themselves. There is also something profoundly freeing about realizing that not every uncomfortable emotion must immediately become someone else's responsibility. Many people unconsciously expect the world to regulate their emotional state for them. They expect others to behave perfectly enough that insecurity, anger or fear never gets activated internally. But that expectation creates emotional fragility because peace becomes dependent on constant external cooperation. The moment life becomes difficult, inner stability collapses with it. Real emotional freedom begins differently. It begins the moment you stop demanding that every person, situation and conversation protect your inner peace for you. That does not mean accepting mistreatment passively. Boundaries still matter, respect still matters, but your emotional stability stops depending entirely on controlling the outside world perfectly. Instead of trying to force everyone else to change first, awareness turns inward and begins understanding the mind itself more honestly. This inward shift transforms conflict completely. Arguments stop being only about proving who is right. They become opportunities for deeper understanding, not understanding of the other person alone, but understanding of yourself. Why does this criticism bother me more than others? Why does this rejection feel unbearable? Why do I need this person's agreement in order to feel emotionally secure? Questions like these quietly reveal the emotional structures shaping behavior beneath awareness. At first, this process can feel unsettling because self-awareness removes many comforting illusions. It becomes harder to view yourself as purely rational when you begin noticing how often emotional reactions are shaped by old fears and unconscious attachment. But strangely enough, this honesty creates far more peace than denial ever could. Once emotional patterns become visible clearly, they lose some of their unconscious control over the mind. Awareness interrupts automatic reaction. The nervous system slowly changes as well. Situations that once triggered immediate emotional overwhelm begin losing some of their intensity because understanding now exists alongside the emotion itself. Someone criticizes you, and instead of collapsing internally, curiosity appears beside the reaction. Someone disrespects you, and instead of instantly escalating emotionally, you notice the deeper attachment beneath the anger. That awareness creates space, and inside that space, emotional freedom quietly begins growing. Marcus Aurelius practiced this kind of inward discipline constantly. He understood that the mind suffers most when it becomes consumed with controlling external events while neglecting internal understanding. Other people will always remain imperfect. Situations will always remain uncertain, but awareness creates stability that external control never can. The more deeply you understand your own mind, the less emotionally dependent you become on controlling everyone around you. And eventually something fundamental changes inside your relationship with conflict itself. You stop approaching difficult moments only as problems to defeat externally. You begin seeing them as reflections revealing where attachment, fear, or insecurities still exist internally. That shift transforms emotional pain into self-understanding. And self-standing creates a kind of freedom no external validation could ever fully provide. Most people move through life fighting battles that never truly end. They argue endlessly trying to correct how others see them. They defend themselves against every criticism, as if misunderstanding somehow threatens their existence. They chase recognition, validation, respect and approval with exhausting intensity, believing peace will finally arrive once they are fully understood by everyone around them. But no matter how many external victories they collect, something internally still feels unsettled. The argument may end, yet the mind continues replaying it. The criticism may disappear, yet insecurity quietly remains underneath. External wins create temporary satisfaction, but inner restlessness survives untouched. This is one of the greatest illusions the ego creates. It convinces people that emotional peace exists somewhere outside themselves, waiting to be earned through victory, status, admiration, or control. And because of that belief, many people spend their entire lives trying to conquer the external world while neglecting the internal one completely. They become experts at managing appearances while remaining strangers to their own mind. They learn how to impress others but not how to sit peacefully with themselves. They become skilled at winning conversations yet emotionally collapse in silence when external validation disappears. The Stoics saw this clearly. They understood that conquering other people means very little if you remain controlled by anger, insecurity, pride or fear internally. A person may dominate every argument and still live in constant emotional instability. They may achieve recognition while remaining deeply dependent on approval. They may appear powerful outwardly while internally feeling fragile the moment criticism appears. External strength without inner discipline creates a life that looks stable from a distance but feels exhausting from within. This is why the Stoics placed so much emphasis on self-mastery rather than social dominance. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that the quality of the mind shapes the quality of life far more than external circumstances ever could. He understood that emotional chaos within the mind cannot be solved by forcing the outside world into perfect alignment. There will always be difficult people. There will always be misunderstanding. There will always be situations beyond control. The real challenge is whether your inner state collapses every time those realities appear. Most people never pause long enough to ask themselves whether the battles they are fighting are actually worth the cost. They become consumed with proving they are right, proving they are valuable, proving they deserve respect. But what happens afterward? The argument ends, yet the nervous system remains tense. Pride feels temporarily satisfied, but peace does not fully return. Emotional exhaustion quietly replaces the temporary rush of victory. This is because emotional conflict often drains far more energy than people realize while they are trapped inside it. There is something deeply revealing about the fact that emotionally reactive people rarely seem truly peaceful even after winning. Their mind remains restless because external victory cannot resolve internal instability. A person who constantly needs validation will continue seeking it no matter how many arguments they win. A person controlled by insecurity will continue feeling threatened no matter how much admiration they receive. Inner conflict simply changes form and continues expressing itself through new situations repeatedly. That is why self-awareness matters more than social victory. Once awareness deepens, the goal of conflict itself begins changing. You stop asking only how to defeat another person's opinion. You begin asking whether the interaction is disturbing your inner clarity unnecessarily. That shift changes everything, because peace becomes more valuable than emotional dominance. You begin realizing that proving yourself endlessly is often a sign of internal uncertainty rather than true confidence. Truly grounded people rarely feel desperate to convince everyone of their worth, because their identity no longer depends completely on external agreement. This does not mean becoming passive or avoiding all confrontation. Some situations absolutely require honesty, boundaries, and difficult conversations. But emotionally mature people approach those moments differently. They speak with intention rather than emotional desperation. Their goal is clarity, not egoic victory, and because of that, they often leave difficult interactions without carrying the same emotional residue reactive people carry for hours or even days afterward. The mind changes profoundly once inner discipline becomes more important than external validation. You stop treating every disagreement like a threat to your identity. You stop obsessing over being understood perfectly by everyone, and gradually emotional stability becomes less dependent on the unpredictable reactions of other people. There is enormous freedom in that shift, because the nervous system no longer feels constantly responsible for controlling every perception and every outcome. Epictetus often reminded his students that no person is free if they are not master of themselves. Most people hear statements like that and immediately think about external freedom. But the deeper meaning points inward. A person completely ruled by pride, fear, anger, or insecurity is not truly free, even if outwardly successful. Their emotional state remains dependent on circumstances remaining favorable. The moment life becomes difficult, inner stability disappears with it. True self-mastery feels quieter than most people expect. It is not dramatic. It does not seek applause constantly. It appears in ordinary moments, remaining calm during criticism, letting go of arguments that do not deserve your peace, walking away from emotional chaos without needing the final word, choosing understanding over impulsive reaction, protecting clarity even when the ego demands conflict. These moments may seem small outwardly, but internally they reshape the entire relationship between awareness and emotion. Over time, the desire to conquer others weakens because understanding yourself becomes far more important. You begin seeing how exhausting constant emotional warfare truly is. The mind feels lighter without the endless need to defend, prove, and dominate. Peace becomes less fragile because it no longer depends entirely on external victory, and eventually something deeper becomes clear. Winning against the world means very little if you continue losing against your own uncontrolled impulses internally. That realization changes the direction of growth completely, because real strength stops being measured by how many people you defeat and starts being measured by how much inner steadiness you can maintain while life remains imperfect around you. As awareness grows, something begins changing quietly in the way you move through daily life. You stop reacting to everything. You stop feeling emotionally obligated to respond to every disagreement, every opinion, every careless comment thrown in your direction. At first, this feels unfamiliar because most people are conditioned to believe every challenge requires immediate engagement. Someone criticizes them, and they feel compelled to defend themselves. Someone misunderstands them, and they rush to explain. Someone behaves disrespectfully, and anger instantly demands retaliation. The nervous system becomes trapped inside constant emotional response, as though inner peace must always be sacrificed in order to protect pride. But emotionally disciplined people begin seeing something others often miss. Attention is expensive. Energy is limited. Every emotional reaction consumes something internally, even when the cost is not immediately visible. One argument may occupy the mind for hours afterward. One resentment may quietly drain emotional stability throughout an entire day. One obsessive attempt to prove yourself can leave the nervous system exhausted long after the conversation itself has ended. Over time, emotionally mature people stop measuring success by how many battles they win. They begin measuring it by how much peace they are able to protect. This changes the way conflict feels completely. Before awareness deepens, every disagreement appears urgent. The ego treats criticism like an emergency. It demands immediate correction, immediate defense, immediate validation. But eventually something shifts internally. You begin realizing that not every opinion deserves access to your emotional state. Not every misunderstanding deserves endless explanation. Not every insult deserves your attention. That realization creates enormous psychological freedom because the mind stops being dragged into emotional chaos by every external disturbance. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed emotional discipline required careful attention toward what truly deserves mental energy. Most people live the opposite way. Their attention is pulled everywhere, into argument, online, into imagined conversations, into resentment about situations they cannot change, into emotional battles that continue long after the original moment has already passed. This constant emotional engagement creates exhaustion people rarely recognize clearly. They assume life itself is draining them, when often it is their own inability to let go that creates much of the suffering. The mind replays situations endlessly because the ego keeps searching for emotional resolution through control. It wants the other person to finally understand. It wants validation restored. It wants justice, recognition, agreement. But many situations never fully provide those things. And if peace depends entirely on receiving them, the mind remains trapped in emotional unrest indefinitely. Emotionally strong people eventually realize something difficult but liberating. Closure is not always something another person gives you. Sometimes closure is the moment you decide your peace matters more than continuing the emotional struggle. That does not mean suppressing truth or abandoning necessary boundaries. It means recognizing that endless emotional attachment to conflict often creates more suffering than the original situation itself. A person who constantly revisits resentment mentally keeps reliving the pain repeatedly, even long after the external moment has passed. This awareness naturally creates selectiveness. You stop engaging impulsively simply because emotion appears. You begin asking whether the interaction deserves your energy before giving it your attention. That question changes behavior profoundly because it interrupts automatic emotional habits. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause long enough to evaluate the true cost of emotional engagement. Is proving this point worth carrying emotional tension for the next several hours? Is this disagreement truly meaningful, or is the ego simply uncomfortable being misunderstood? Does this person actually deserve access to my inner peace? Those questions create emotional clarity because they force awareness back into the present moment. Most reactive behavior happens unconsciously. People follow emotional impulses automatically without considering long-term consequences. But emotional maturity slows the process down. You begin seeing how much energy is lost through unnecessary conflict. The mind becomes lighter once it stops trying to manage every external disturbance constantly. There is also a quiet confidence that develops when you stop needing to respond to everything. Emotionally reactive people often mistake restraint for weakness because they assume strength must always appear aggressive outwardly. But grounded people understand something deeper. Remaining calm while choosing not to engage impulsively often requires far more discipline than emotional retaliation ever will. It takes strength to leave misunderstandings unresolved temporarily without collapsing internally. It takes strength to let criticism exist without desperately trying to erase it immediately. It takes strength to protect your peace instead of sacrificing it for temporary emotional satisfaction. Over time, this selectiveness reshapes the nervous system completely. Situations that once created overwhelming emotional urgency begin losing some of their control. Someone behaves carelessly, and instead of becoming consumed by frustration, awareness quietly recognizes that carrying the irritation further only prolongs suffering. Someone seeks conflict, and instead of emotionally matching their energy, you observe the situation without automatically participating in it. The mind becomes steadier because it is no longer reacting compulsively to every disturbance appearing throughout the day. This does not make life emotionless, it makes it intentional. Your attention stops being handed away automatically to every passing frustration. Emotional energy becomes protected more carefully because you understand how valuable inner clarity truly is. Most people never learn this because they remain trapped in cycles of constant reaction. They spend years exhausting themselves emotionally while believing the outside world is entirely responsible for their inner condition. But eventually something changes once awareness deepens enough. The goal is no longer winning every interaction. The goal becomes protecting the state of mind that allows you to remain grounded regardless of what happens around you. And that shift transforms daily life in quiet but powerful ways. Because the more selective you become with your attention, the less emotional chaos controls your inner world. One of the quietest sources of suffering in human life comes from expectation, not pain itself, not difficulty itself, but the belief that life was supposed to unfold differently than it did. People expect honesty and become devastated by deception. They expect loyalty and become shattered by betrayal. They expect fairness and become consumed by bitterness when life refuses to cooperate with those expectations. Much of emotional pain is intensified not only by what happened, but by the shock that it happened at all. The mind resists reality because reality violated the version of life it was secretly hoping for. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on preparation, not pessimism, not emotional numbness, preparation. They understood that a person emotionally prepared for difficulty remains far steadier than someone who assumes life will always move according to personal preference. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that difficult people would appear throughout his day, not because he hated humanity, but because he wanted awareness before reaction. He knew that expecting perfection from people guarantees emotional frustration, because human beings are flawed, emotional, inconsistent, and often struggling internally themselves. Most people move through life doing the opposite. They unconsciously expect others to behave according to their personal standards. They expect everyone to communicate clearly, act maturely, remain honest, and respond thoughtfully under pressure. And when reality fails to match those expectations, emotional chaos begins immediately. Disappointment turns into resentment. Frustration turns into anger. The nervous system reacts not only to the situation itself, but to the collapse of expectation underneath it. The mind keeps saying this should not have happened, even while reality is already proving otherwise. There is something psychologically exhausting about constantly fighting reality instead of preparing for it honestly. A person who expects life to always feel fair becomes emotionally fragile because ordinary human behavior starts feeling personally offensive. Criticism becomes unbearable. Rejection feels catastrophic. Misunderstanding feels deeply unfair. The mind becomes shocked repeatedly by experiences that are actually part of ordinary life. But emotional preparation changes the relationship with difficulty entirely. Preparation does not remove pain completely. It removes unnecessary surprise, and surprise amplifies suffering far more than many people realize. Think about how differently the mind reacts when difficulty is expected versus unexpected. A person prepared internally for criticism hears harsh words differently than someone who believed they would always be understood. A person emotionally prepared for disappointment recovers more steadily than someone who believed kindness guaranteed kindness in return. The situation may still hurt, but the nervous system does not collapse under the weight of disbelief. At the same time, this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Stoic thinking. Many people wrongly assume the Stoics wanted emotional coldness or cynical detachment from life. But that was never the goal. The goal was resilience. They understood that emotional stability requires accepting reality as it is, rather than demanding it behave according to personal preference constantly. Human beings can be selfish. Sometimes people misunderstand each other. Trust gets broken. Situations become unfair. None of this means life is meaningless. It means life is real. The more deeply someone accepts this reality, the less emotionally shattered they become when difficulty appears. Not because they stop caring, but because they stop being psychologically blindsided by ordinary human imperfection. They stop expecting flawless behavior from imperfect people. They stop expecting life to move without friction. And because of that, emotional recovery becomes faster. The mind spends less time trapped in resistance against reality and more time responding consciously to what already exists. There is also something strangely calming about emotional preparation. It creates steadiness. A person who understands that criticism may come no longer feels completely destabilized by disagreement. A person who understands that some people will disappoint them no longer collapses emotionally every time human imperfection appears. This awareness does not create bitterness. In fact, it often creates greater compassion because expectations become more realistic. You stop demanding perfection from yourself and others simultaneously. The ego resists this kind of wisdom because the ego wants certainty, control, and emotional comfort constantly. It wants guarantees that people will always behave fairly. It wants reassurance that pain will never arrive unexpectedly. But life refuses to provide those guarantees fully. The Stoics understood that emotional freedom comes not from controlling uncertainty, but from strengthening the mind enough to face uncertainty without falling apart internally. This awareness changes the way you experience difficult moments completely. Someone disappoints you, and instead of reacting with total emotional devastation, awareness quietly remembers that human beings are imperfect. Someone criticizes you unfairly, and instead of spiraling into emotional chaos, the mind remains grounded enough to recognize that misunderstanding is part of life. Sometimes emotional pain still exists, but panic weakens because preparation already created space for reality before the situation appeared. Over time, this practice reshapes emotional resilience deeply. The nervous system becomes less reactive because difficulty no longer feels shocking every time it appears. Delays stop feeling like personal attacks. Criticism stops feeling like emotional destruction. Rejection stops feeling like proof of worthlessness. The mind becomes steadier because expectations become more aligned with reality rather than fantasy. This does not make life negative, it makes awareness realistic, and realistic awareness creates strength that emotional denial never can. A person who expects no difficulty remains fragile. A person prepared for difficulty becomes adaptable. That adaptability creates peace because the mind stops demanding perfect conditions in order to remain stable. Eventually, something important becomes clear. Emotional suffering grows strongest when reality collides violently with unrealistic expectation. But once awareness learns to expect difficulty as part of the human experience, life loses some of its power to emotionally devastate you. The world remains imperfect, but your inner state becomes far more prepared to move through it without constantly collapsing under the weight of surprise. A great deal of emotional suffering disappears the moment a person stops expecting life to constantly move according to personal preference. So much frustration comes from unconscious resistance to reality itself. People create silent expectations about how others should behave, how situations should unfold, how quickly progress should happen, and how fairly life should treat them. Then reality arrives with its unpredictability, imperfections, delays, and disappointments, and the mind reacts as though something has gone terribly wrong. But often nothing unusual has happened at all. Life simply failed to match the image the mind secretly created beforehand. This is why ordinary inconveniences affect some people so deeply. Traffic ruins their mood. Delays create anger. Criticism feels unbearable. Rejection becomes emotionally catastrophic. The nervous system reacts not only to the event itself, but to the violation of expectation underneath it. The mind quietly says this should not be happening, and emotional resistance begins immediately. That resistance is exhausting because reality continues existing regardless of how strongly the mind argues against it internally. The Stoics understood that emotional stability depends greatly on accepting the nature of life instead of constantly demanding different conditions from it. Human beings are imperfect. Situations become difficult, plans fail, misunderstandings happen, progress moves slowly sometimes. None of these realities are personal attacks against you. They are simply part of being alive. Once this truth settles deeply into awareness, frustration begins losing much of its emotional force because the mind stops interpreting discomfort as evidence that reality itself is broken. This shift changes the emotional atmosphere of daily life completely. Instead of treating every inconvenience like an emotional emergency, you begin seeing discomfort as something natural rather than shocking. A difficult conversation no longer feels like proof the entire day is ruined. A delayed outcome no longer creates panic. Criticism no longer automatically threatens your identity. The nervous system becomes steadier because reality is no longer constantly colliding against unrealistic expectation. The mind begins cooperating with life instead of fighting against it endlessly. Many people spend years emotionally exhausted because they interpret discomfort too personally. Someone behaves rudely, and the mind immediately assumes disrespect was targeted specifically to wound them deeply. A plan falls apart, and frustration quickly becomes self-pity. Something difficult happens, and the nervous system reacts as though life itself is unfairly attacking them. This mindset quietly creates fragility because emotional stability becomes dependent on perfect circumstances, and perfect circumstances never exist for very long. The Stoics approach discomfort differently. They trained themselves to understand that challenge, inconvenience, uncertainty, and frustration are woven naturally into the human experience. Difficulties are not interruptions to life. They are part of life itself. That perspective creates enormous resilience because the mind stops viewing discomfort as abnormal. Instead of resisting reality emotionally, awareness learns how to move through it calmly. This does not mean pretending painful situations feel pleasant. It means understanding that emotional suffering increases dramatically when resistance is added to unavoidable difficulty. Physical pain may exist. Disappointment may exist. But much of the emotional chaos surrounding those experiences comes from the belief that they should not exist at all. The mind fights reality internally, and that internal battle often becomes more exhausting than the original situation itself. Once awareness begins accepting this, something surprising happens. Emotional recovery becomes faster. Frustration loses intensity more quickly because the mind stops feeding it unnecessary resistance. A difficult moment still feels difficult, but it no longer defines the entire emotional state of the day. Someone behaves unfairly, and instead of collapsing into outrage, awareness quietly recognizes that imperfect behavior is part of human nature. A setback appears, and instead of interpreting it as personal failure, the mind remains grounded enough to adapt. This creates a kind of psychological flexibility that emotionally reactive people rarely experience. They become trapped because their emotional stability depends entirely on life unfolding according to expectation. When expectation collapses, their peace collapses with it. But emotionally grounded people develop stability differently. Their calmness comes not from controlling life perfectly, but from accepting that uncertainty and discomfort will always exist to some degree. There is also something deeply freeing about no longer taking every difficulty personally. The world stops feeling like it is constantly working against you. Delays become ordinary instead of emotionally devastating. Rejection becomes information instead of destruction. Criticism becomes manageable instead of catastrophic. The mind becomes lighter because it stops carrying the exhausting belief that every painful experience means something has gone terribly wrong internally. Over time, this awareness reshapes the nervous system profoundly. Emotional reactions begin slowing down naturally because reality no longer feels constantly threatening. The mind stops panicking every time plans shift unexpectedly. It stops interpreting discomfort as evidence of failure. Life becomes easier to navigate, not because difficulty disappears, but because awareness stops magnifying every difficulty into emotional catastrophe. This shift also creates more compassion toward others. Once you accept your own humanity more honestly, you stop demanding impossible perfection from everyone around you. People disappoint each other sometimes. Miscommunication happens. Emotional mistakes happen. Expectations fail. Instead of reacting with constant outrage, awareness begins recognizing that imperfection is shared by everyone. That understanding softens emotional rigidity without removing healthy boundaries. The ego resists this perspective because the ego wants certainty and control. It wants life to remain predictable and comfortable at all times, but reality continues changing regardless of those demands. The more tightly someone clings to unrealistic expectation, the more fragile their emotional state becomes. When life inevitably refuses to cooperate perfectly, eventually something deeper becomes clear. Peace does not come from eliminating discomfort completely. It comes from changing your relationship with discomfort itself. Once the mind stops interpreting every inconvenience as a personal attack, emotional resilience begins growing naturally. The world remains imperfect, but your inner stability no longer depends entirely on perfect conditions existing around you, and that realization creates a calmness far stronger than temporary comfort ever could. Something subtle begins changing after practicing emotional discipline consistently for long enough. At first, the progress feels almost invisible. Reactions still appear. Frustration still rises. Certain comments still create emotional tension internally, but gradually the intensity begins weakening. Situations that once ruined entire days start losing their emotional grip much faster. The nervous system no longer reacts to every disturbance with the same urgency. Space appears where automatic reaction once lived, and inside that space, awareness quietly grows stronger than impulse. This transformation often surprises people because it does not feel, or emotions disappear completely. The world remains unpredictable. Difficult people still exist. Criticism still appears. Stress still arrives unexpectedly. But your relationship with those experiences begins changing deeply. Someone attempts to provoke you, and instead of immediately absorbing their emotional energy, you notice the behavior without becoming consumed by it. Sarcasm no longer pulls you into unnecessary conflict automatically. Disrespect no longer destroys your internal stability the way it once did. The situation may still register emotionally, but it stops controlling the entire atmosphere of your mind. This shift changes the energy you carry into conversations without you needing to force it artificially. Before awareness deepened, much of your behavior may have been unconsciously shaped by emotional neediness. The need to be understood immediately. The need to be respected constantly. The need to prove yourself, defend yourself, or gain validation from the people around you. Most people carry this emotional tension without realizing it. They walk into rooms silently, hoping to be accepted, admired, approved of, or emotionally reassured in some way. And because of that, their inner state remains highly vulnerable to the reactions of others. But emotional steadiness changes this dynamic completely. The less dependent you become on external validation, the calmer your presence naturally becomes. You stop chasing approval in subtle ways. Conversations become less emotionally loaded because your identity no longer depends entirely on how others respond to you. Someone disagrees with you, and instead of feeling personally threatened, you remain internally grounded. Someone misunderstands you, and while it may still feel uncomfortable, the mind no longer collapses into panic trying to correct every perception immediately. People notice this kind of stability even when nothing is spoken directly about it. There is something unmistakable about a person who no longer reacts compulsively to emotional pressure. Most interactions between people involve unconscious emotional exchanges. Someone projects frustration, someone seeks validation, someone tests boundaries, someone unconsciously searches for emotional control within the conversation. Reactive people become absorbed into these dynamics instantly because they are responding automatically rather than consciously. But emotionally disciplined individuals interrupt the pattern simply through their presence. This can feel strange to people who are used to controlling others emotionally through reaction. They may become frustrated when sarcasm no longer provokes you. They may push harder when emotional manipulation stops working the way it once did. But eventually something becomes clear. A person who remains grounded internally becomes difficult to emotionally control because their peace is no longer entirely dependent on external behavior, remaining favorable over time. Emotional discipline also changes the way you perceive others. Instead of instantly personalizing negativity, you begin recognizing how much human behavior is driven by internal struggle. A rude comment often reveals pain more than confidence. Constant criticism often reveals insecurity more than superiority. Emotional manipulation often comes from fear of losing control. Once you see this clearly, emotional reactions soften naturally because understanding creates distance from personal offense. You stop absorbing everything as an attack against your worth. This does not make you passive or emotionally detached. It makes you calmer. There is a difference. Calmness allows you to respond intentionally rather than impulsively. Boundaries still exist. Difficult conversations still happen. But emotional chaos no longer dominates the interaction completely. The mind remains clearer because awareness stays present even during tension. One of the most powerful parts of this transformation is how much lighter life begins feeling internally. You stop carrying endless emotional residue from every interaction. Conversations end without being replayed for hours. Criticism passes through the mind without becoming obsession. Other people's moods stop determining your emotional condition constantly. Attention becomes less scattered because the nervous system is no longer reacting compulsively to every disturbance appearing throughout the day. There is also a quiet confidence that develops naturally from this stability. Not arrogance, not superiority, something quieter than that. You stop needing to announce your strength because your behavior reflects it consistently. You stop seeking constant reassurance because your self-worth no longer depends entirely on external agreement. And strangely enough, the less desperate you become for validation, the more grounded your presence begins feeling to others around you. This is why emotional discipline changes more than isolated reactions. It changes identity itself. You stop seeing yourself as someone constantly at the mercy of other people's opinions, moods, or behavior. Instead, you begin recognizing that peace can exist independently from external chaos if awareness remains strong enough to protect it. That realization creates stability few people ever fully experience, because most remain emotionally entangled with every disturbance life places in front of them. Eventually, the mind becomes quieter, not because life stopped testing you, but because your inner world stopped reacting to every test as though survival itself depended on the outcome. And inside that steadiness, a different kind of strength quietly begins speaking for itself without needing constant explanation. Perhaps the deepest change does not happen in the way you deal with other people. It happens in the relationship you develop with yourself. Before awareness grows, many people abandon themselves emotionally without even realizing it. Someone criticizes them, and immediately they begin questioning their worth. Someone rejects them, and suddenly they feel less valuable as a human being. Someone disapproves of their choices, and the mind instantly starts shrinking itself in order to regain acceptance. Their emotional state becomes completely tied to how they are being received by the outside world. And because the outside world constantly changes, their peace remains fragile almost all the time. Most people never notice how much power they hand away through this pattern. They allow strangers, conversations, opinions, and temporary situations to determine how they feel about themselves internally. A compliment creates confidence. A criticism destroys it. Approval creates emotional comfort. Rejection creates emotional collapse. The mind becomes dependent on external feedback because identity was never fully grounded from within. And when identity depends entirely on outside validation, emotional stability becomes impossible to maintain consistently. This is why disapproval affects some people so deeply. It is rarely just about the opinion itself. The deeper fear is often emotional abandonment, the fear of not being accepted, respected, admired, or valued enough. Many people spend years adjusting themselves constantly in order to avoid this discomfort. They hide parts of their personality to fit expectations. They over-explain themselves, hoping to avoid misunderstanding. They become emotionally exhausted trying to gain approval from people who may never fully understand them anyway. And underneath all of it is the quiet belief that external acceptance determines internal worth. The Stoics challenged this belief completely. They believed that inner peace becomes possible only when self-worth stops depending entirely on the unstable opinions of other people. That perspective creates enormous emotional freedom because it separates identity from external reaction. Criticism may still hurt sometimes. Rejection may still feel painful. But those experiences stop defining the entire relationship you have with yourself internally. This distinction changes everything. A person emotionally dependent on approval experiences criticism as destruction, because identity itself feels threatened. But a person grounded internally approaches criticism differently. They listen calmly enough to determine whether the criticism contains truth. If it does, they learn from it. If it does not, they allow it to pass without turning it into self-hatred. That ability protects peace because self-worth no longer rises and falls with every external opinion. The same shift happens with rejection. Most people interpret rejection personally because they unconsciously believe acceptance equals value. But awareness slowly reveals something deeper. Rejection does not automatically mean you are unworthy. Sometimes it simply means two paths do not align. Sometimes people reject what they do not understand. Sometimes they reject from their own fear, limitation, or emotional confusion. Human beings are complicated, and once you stop attaching your identity completely to external acceptance, rejection loses much of its power to emotionally destroy you. This does not make you emotionally cold. In fact, it often creates greater emotional honesty. You stop performing constantly for approval. You stop shaping your entire identity around pleasing others, and because of that, your relationships become more authentic. You no longer need every interaction to confirm your worth, because you are no longer emotionally abandoning yourself whenever someone responds negatively. There is also something deeply stabilizing about realizing that offense itself requires participation. Someone may say something disrespectful, unfair, or insulting, but the emotional suffering continues only if the mind keeps carrying the offense internally afterward. Most people replay hurtful moments repeatedly because the ego keeps reopening the emotional wound through thought. The situation ends externally, yet internally, the mind continues feeding it attention. Awareness interrupts this cycle by recognizing that another person's words cannot permanently control your inner state unless you continue giving them emotional authority. The Stoics understood that peace becomes stronger when the mind stops personalizing every external disturbance. Someone else's opinion is not automatically truth. Someone else's rejection is not automatically proof of inadequacy. Someone else's negativity is not automatically your burden to carry. Once this awareness settles deeply into the nervous system, emotional reactions begin softening naturally because identity is no longer built entirely around outside validation. Over time, the fear of disapproval weakens. You stop needing everyone to agree with your choices. You stop feeling emotionally shattered every time someone misunderstands your intentions. Criticism still exists, but it no longer completely destabilizes your relationship with yourself. That internal shift changes your entire presence because peace no longer feels fragile and conditional. It becomes rooted somewhere deeper than public approval. This is where emotional independence quietly begins. Not isolation, not emotional numbness. Independence, the ability to remain connected to your own worth, even when external reactions fluctuate. Most people never experience this because they spend their lives chasing emotional permission from the outside world. Permission to feel worthy, permission to feel accepted, permission to feel enough. But awareness slowly reveals that peace cannot survive when your identity belongs entirely to other people's opinions. And eventually, something powerful happens internally. You stop betraying yourself emotionally in order to avoid discomfort. You stop collapsing under criticism automatically. You stop measuring your value through temporary reactions from imperfect people. The mind becomes calmer because self-worth no longer depends on constant external reassurance. And once that shift becomes stable enough, peace stops feeling like something fragile that other people can easily take away. It begins feeling like something rooted inside you, something quieter, steadier, and far more difficult for the world to disturb. At its deepest level, this way of thinking was never only about controlling emotion, it was about freedom, real freedom. Not the kind people usually chase through money, status, or external success, but inner freedom. Freedom from becoming emotionally controlled by every opinion, every rejection, every insult, and every difficult situation life places in front of you. Most people spend years believing they are free, while their emotional state remains completely dependent on external conditions. A single criticism ruins their confidence. A single disappointment changes their mood for days. One moment of disrespect consumes their thoughts endlessly. Their peace exists only when life behaves the way they want it to. The Stoics recognized how fragile that kind of existence becomes. A person emotionally dependent on external validation will always feel unstable because the outside world constantly changes. People misunderstand each other. Approval disappears. Opinions shift. Expectations fail. If your inner state rises and falls with all of those movements, peace becomes temporary by definition. That is why emotional discipline matters so much. It protects the mind from becoming enslaved by circumstances it cannot fully control. Many people misunderstand freedom because they associate it only with external independence. They think freedom means doing whatever they want whenever they want. But a person completely ruled by anger is not free. A person controlled by insecurity is not free. A person emotionally addicted to validation is not free. Their emotional reactions decide their behavior long before conscious awareness enters the situation. They become pulled around internally by fear, pride, resentment, jealousy, and approval, without even noticing how much power those impulses hold over their life. This is why the Stoics focused so heavily on mastering the self. They understood that the greatest prison often exists inside the unexamined mind. A person may appear successful outwardly while remaining emotionally trapped internally. They may constantly seek recognition because silence feels unbearable. They may argue endlessly because disagreement threatens their identity. They may become consumed by criticism because self-worth depends entirely on approval. None of this creates peace. It creates dependency. And dependency always creates fear, because anything you emotionally depend on can eventually control you. Real liberation begins the moment awareness becomes stronger than compulsion. You stop reacting automatically simply because emotion appears. Anger may still rise, but you no longer feel obligated to obey it immediately. Rejection may still hurt, but it no longer destroys your relationship with yourself internally. Criticism may still feel uncomfortable, but it stops defining your identity completely. This shift changes the nervous system profoundly, because emotional experiences stop controlling the entire direction of the mind. There is something deeply powerful about being able to remain calm while another person loses control emotionally. Not because you feel superior, but because your inner state no longer depends entirely on mirroring the emotional energy around you. Most people unconsciously absorb whatever emotional atmosphere surrounds them. Anger creates anger. Anxiety creates anxiety. Conflict spreads quickly between people who are unaware of themselves internally, but emotional freedom interrupts that pattern. You begin realizing that another person's emotional chaos does not require your participation. This kind of steadiness often confuses reactive people because they expect emotional engagement. They expect defensiveness, retaliation, and emotional escalation. When those reactions fail to appear, the dynamic changes completely. A person who no longer reacts compulsively becomes difficult to emotionally manipulate because their peace is not constantly available for negotiation. They no longer need every conversation to confirm their worth. They no longer collapse emotionally every time misunderstanding appears. That does not mean becoming emotionally detached from life. The Stoics never taught emotional numbness. They taught awareness, strong enough to prevent emotions from becoming tyrants over the mind. You still feel disappointment. You still experience sadness, frustration, and hurt. But those emotions stop defining your entire identity. They become temporary experiences moving through awareness, rather than permanent forces controlling behavior unconsciously. This creates enormous internal relief, because the mind no longer feels trapped inside constant emotional struggle. You stop carrying resentment everywhere you go. You stop replaying conversations endlessly trying to defend your image. You stop needing everyone to agree with your perspective in order to feel emotionally secure. Life becomes psychologically lighter because attention is no longer consumed by endless egoic conflict. One of the greatest forms of freedom comes from allowing people to misunderstand you without collapsing internally. Most people fear misunderstanding because they believe acceptance determines worth. They spend years trying to manage every perception carefully, hoping to avoid criticism or rejection completely. But that pursuit becomes exhausting because human beings will always interpret each other imperfectly. Sometimes the moment you stop demanding perfect understanding from everyone around you, emotional pressure begins disappearing naturally. That perspective creates calmness because identity stops depending entirely on outside approval. You become less emotionally desperate to control how every person sees you. And strangely enough, the less desperate you become for validation, the steadier your presence naturally feels. This is why emotional freedom changes every area of life quietly. Relationships become healthier because they are no longer built entirely on emotional dependence. Conflict becomes less consuming because the ego no longer demands victory at all costs. Criticism becomes manageable because awareness can separate useful truth from unnecessary projection. Even solitude begins feeling different because self-worth no longer disappears the moment external attention fades. Over time, the mind becomes calmer, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because inner stability stops depending entirely on external conditions remaining favorable. You begin moving through difficult moments without losing yourself emotionally every time discomfort appears. The world still contains uncertainty, criticism, disappointment, and conflict, but awareness becomes strong enough to remain grounded within those experiences, instead of being controlled by them completely. And eventually the deepest realization begins settling into place. Freedom was never about controlling the outside world perfectly. It was about no longer being psychologically enslaved by every emotion, every opinion, and every disturbance life places in front of you. Once awareness becomes steady enough, peace stops feeling fragile. It becomes something carried internally, even while the world around you remains imperfect. Eventually, after enough moments of reflection, restraint, disappointment, and self-observation, something changes in a way that feels permanent. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because you finally stop expecting the world to protect your peace for you. The noise outside still exists. People still judge. Some misunderstand your intentions completely. Others project their own frustration onto you without warning. Difficult conversations still happen. Delays still happen. Life still places pressure on the mind in ways that feel unfair sometimes. But internally, your relationship with those experiences becomes completely different. The emotional chaos outside no longer automatically creates emotional chaos within. This realization changes the direction of your entire life, because you stop chasing control in places where it was never fully possible to begin with. Most people spend years trying to manage the outside world emotionally. They try to control how others see them, how others speak to them, how situations unfold, how quickly success arrives, and how perfectly life aligns with expectation. But no amount of effort can fully guarantee those outcomes. Human beings remain unpredictable. Circumstances change constantly. Opinions shift overnight. The world refuses to become stable enough to permanently satisfy the emotional demands of the ego. That is why external control can never create lasting peace. Even when life feels calm temporarily, fear remains underneath, because the mind knows conditions can change again at any moment. A person whose stability depends entirely on favorable circumstances will always feel vulnerable internally. The approval may disappear, the respect may disappear, the comfort may disappear, And when identity depends completely on those things, emotional panic follows close behind their loss. But awareness changes this relationship slowly. You begin realizing that the true battle was never against difficult people or uncomfortable situations alone. The deeper struggle was internal. It was the battle between awareness and impulse, between clarity and emotional chaos, between the part of you seeking peace and the part still addicted to emotional reaction. Once this becomes visible clearly, the focus of growth shifts inward permanently. You stop asking how to force the world into perfect behavior and start learning how to remain grounded regardless of the world's behavior instead. This does not mean painful moments disappear. Criticism can still sting sometimes. Rejection can still hurt. Disappointment still exists. But those experiences stop controlling your identity completely. They stop defining your worth. They stop determining the emotional atmosphere of your entire inner world. Awareness creates separation between external events and internal collapse. And inside that separation, peace finally has room to exist consistently. The Stoics understood this deeply. Most people hear those ideas intellectually without fully realizing how life-changing they become once practiced consistently. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically to every disturbance, emotional freedom begins appearing naturally. There is something profoundly powerful about remaining calm in situations that once would have emotionally consumed you. Not because you are suppressing emotion, but because awareness is finally stronger than unconscious reaction. Someone insults you, and instead of immediately losing yourself emotionally, you remain present enough to choose your response consciously. Someone misunderstands you, and instead of spiraling into desperate self-defense, you recognize that your identity does not depend entirely on another person's perception. The world outside may remain unstable, but internally something steadier begins holding everything together. This changes your entire presence. You stop radiating emotional desperation. Conversations become lighter because you are no longer fighting constantly for validation, recognition, or control. Other people's moods stop deciding your emotional condition. Criticism stops echoing endlessly inside your head. You begin protecting your attention more carefully because you finally understand that attention shapes emotional reality profoundly. Whatever controls your attention eventually influences your inner state. Over time, this awareness creates a calmness that feels different from temporary comfort. Temporary comfort disappears, is the moment life becomes difficult. But grounded awareness survives even inside discomfort because it is no longer dependent on perfection externally. That is the difference. Peace stops feeling fragile. It stops feeling conditional. Instead of needing every circumstance to cooperate emotionally, you learn how to remain centered while life continues unfolding unpredictably around you. This is where conscious living truly begins. Most reactive people move through life unconsciously, pulled constantly by emotion, fear, pride, insecurity, and impulse, without recognizing what is happening internally. Their reactions decide their behavior before awareness has time to enter the moment. But conscious living interrupts that cycle. It creates space between emotion and action. It allows clarity to exist before reaction takes control. And gradually the mind becomes less chaotic because awareness remains present more consistently. There is also a quiet dignity that emerges from this way of living. You stop needing emotional victory in every interaction. You stop trying to dominate conversations to protect your ego. You stop carrying resentment through the mind endlessly. Instead, energy returns inward toward understanding yourself more deeply. And strangely enough, the less attached you become to controlling external outcomes, the more internally stable you begin feeling. The world itself may never become peaceful. Human beings will continue struggling with fear, insecurity, anger, pride, and misunderstanding. Conflict will always exist to some degree. But the most important realization is that your peace does not need to disappear simply because chaos exists around you. That is the freedom the Stoics were pointing toward all along. Not escape from life, but stability within life, and eventually you understand something that changes everything quietly but permanently. Real victory was never about controlling other people, avoiding criticism, or eliminating discomfort completely. Real victory was learning how to remain connected to yourself while moving through all of it. Because once awareness becomes steady enough to stay grounded inside emotional chaos, the world loses much of its ability to control your inner state, and in that moment, life stops being something you merely react to emotionally. It becomes something you move through consciously with clarity, steadiness and peace that no longer depends entirely on the outside world remaining calm. And maybe that is the real purpose of all of this. Not becoming untouchable, not becoming emotionless, but becoming steady enough that the chaos of the world no longer steals your inner peace every time life becomes difficult. Because the moment you stop reacting to everything, you begin seeing life more clearly. And the moment you begin mastering yourself, the world loses much of its power over you. If this message stayed with you, take a moment and continue this journey with one of the videos appearing on the screen now. Sometimes a single idea deeply understood can change the direction of an entire life. Thank you for being part of Stoicism.